Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Kevin. Kevin, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Can you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure. Hi, I'm Kevin Wetmore. Do you need more? Or who I am, what I do? What are we
Yeah,
doing?
what do you do?
What do I do? I am a professor at Loyola Marymount University. I am a horror writer and an actor, director, and stage combat choreographer. I teach actors how to hurt each other safely. But most of my output in terms of writing has been about horror culture, horror cinema, looking at the intersections between what we fear and the stories we tell ourselves. So I've edited books, for example, on Stranger Things and the Netflix series The Haunting of Hill House. I just co-edited a book on theater and the macabre. And then I've written books, for example, on the film The Changeling or the Conjuring, looking at remakes of George Romero's zombie films. And most recently, I wrote a book called Eaters of the Dead, Myths and Realities of Cannibal Monsters, looking at sort of this universal human fear of being eaten, particularly after we're dead, and how it manifests as monsters, particularly in food scarce areas. And then the last part of the book just sort of deals with the myths and realities of actual cannibals and how we can't stop telling cannibal stories.
Okay, let's start off with the cannibal topic first. So the myths and realities. I know that there's been real cannibals. It's very rare, but there's also some cultures, back in the day used to believe in eating people. I know there's a specific, I think it's a disease called Crutchfield syndrome, something. I'm going to get the name wrong, but it's like mad cow disease, but for humans.
Yes, Creutzfeldt, I think it is syndrome, but I could be wrong on that. It's been a minute. You're right. It is rare as sort of a societal thing, but cannibalism itself is not just one thing; it's a bunch of things. So perhaps the most prevalent example of cannibalism in human history is what we call survival cannibalism. So when a ship sinks and there are five guys in a lifeboat, there's a thing called the law of the sea where you draw straws. Shortest straw dies. Second shortest straw is the guy who has to kill him, and then the remaining four people get to eat and stay alive. So we have a number of examples from history of ship sinking and survival cannibalism happening. We have records from, for example, the Holodomor in Ukraine, where Stalin sort of created this artificial famine and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people are starving. And we know that families ended up eating the family members who died, or neighbors sometimes ate their neighbors not because they wanted to or because culturally it was acceptable, but because my choice is I can eat this dead body or I can die myself. So that's what we call survival cannibalism. The Donner Party might be, for example, the perfect example of that. We've sort of romanticized and mythologized the Donner Party, but by and large, for the most part, it was a bunch of people trapped in snow with no food, who eventually, as their party members began to die, sort of came up with this system of, okay, if someone dies, anyone not related to that person will eat parts of that person in order to stay alive. So the one rule was no incestuous cannibalism. You can't eat anyone you're related to. And that was how members of the Donner Party survived. Um,
That's the plane incident, right?
the Donner Party is in California, a group of people who were trying to make it to Sacramento to start a new life. And they took a cutoff that turned out to actually take them hundreds of miles out of their way. And they found themselves in the Sierra Nevadas in 10 feet of snow with very little food. And so eventually they turned to cannibalism. And this is in the 1840s, and it was sort of shocked the nation that these pioneer people would eat their own. The plane is actually the Uruguayan rugby team, memorialized in the film Alive, and I think influences the more recent, I think it's Showtime series, Yellow Jackets, which is also about a sporting team in a plane crash, where eventually, as the food runs out, you say, look, we have all this meat around us. Uh, the only way we're going to survive is if we consume the bodies of the dead. So looking at how we have these taboos of doing bad things to corpses. You're not supposed to do that. And of eating and being eaten. We're sort of terrified of being eaten. One of our oldest memories is of being prey. And when you think about why we're so atavistically afraid of snakes, for example, it's because earlier in the species, We could climb trees and get away from the lions and the Komodo dragons, but the snakes can get up there with us. And when you wake up, that thing is there and ready to bite you, and it's nasty. So a lot of our fear, I don't care how cool you are. I grew up on the ocean, and after Jaws, I think I didn't swim for a few years because it's that notion of what you cannot see below you might want to eat you. And now there might be a shark that can take me in a couple bites. I don't like that idea. And it's funny because I talk to students now and I ask them, is anyone else here, when I start teaching horror classes, is anyone else here afraid of pool sharks? And they're like, people who play pool. I'm like, no. Have you ever jumped in a pool and then when you surface, just look around and make sure there isn't a shark? And some people laugh, but about 90% of the class is like, yeah, I've actually done that. There's no possible way there is a shark in this pool, but you still need to check to remind yourself there isn't. And that's our fear as a species of we don't want to be eaten. And so, particularly when you think about it, it's this notion of after I die, that's not the end. Then other people are going to eat my body. That's a little scary. The funny thing is, there are cultures that practice mortuary cannibalism, where they're like, "Oh my God, you bury your dead? You put your family and friends in the earth? That's so disgusting and unhygienic." And the idea is the family and friends of the dead person consume the parts of the body that can be consumed as a way of sort of incorporating this ancestor or this family member or this friend and keeping them sacred. In sky burial for the Zoroastrians, fire is too sacred and the ground is too sacred. Dead bodies would pollute them. So instead, they take dead bodies and put them in large stone structures to be eaten by birds. For Zoroastrians, they're called towers of silence, and the priest will dismember the body and leave it out for birds to consume. And then once the body has been stripped down to the bones, they'll grind up the bones and store them within stone chambers so that the earth and fire are not being contaminated by them. So once you start looking at cannibal monsters and historic cannibals, you start to learn a lot about people's ideas about the dead and how we are to interact with them and what we think about death and what we are afraid of. And so,
Common example would be like somebody that wants to get buried compared to someone who thinks that's weird and rather being, in an urn. I know plenty of people that want to cremate others, and I guess it's good. I don't care what happens when I die. As long as it's not like the Egyptians where they're like your body is a vessel until the afterlife. Because if I'm a pile of ash in the afterlife, I'm gonna be pissed.
yeah, it's really going to ruin your social life. Robbie's here. He's this pile of ash, so he's the designated driver. Yeah, it's not going to work that way. I think. Well, the funny thing is, you bring up burial versus cremation, and we've now have this sort of water cremation that they're talking about, and tree burial. We're constantly sort of looking for ways to make the disposal of dead bodies more green. Part of the problem, for example, is the dead outnumber the living. And so, if we just continue to bury bodies, there isn't enough room on the planet for everyone who's here and going to die.
Did you look up
So
the government robot it was called Eater? It's
Eater, that's the book ends talking about Eater, a battlefield robot that is powered by consuming the bodies of enemy soldiers. That's not at all disturbing.
But I mean, it's smart if you're looking at like its own fuel is the thing that it consumes.
From a purely mechanical point of view, its genius is its simplicity. You're creating a robot to fight a war, and it consumes the bodies of dead soldiers to fuel itself, so it can, it's sort of perpetually fed as it fights. Uh, but the people who invented this, I believe, have never seen any of the Terminator movies. Because anytime you give a machine, the ability to do something like that, it doesn't go well for us as a species. If cinema's taught me anything, it's leave the computers alone. And while you're at it, leave the dead bodies alone. Don't go in the haunted house. And if you're going to start chanting in Latin, this is going to be the worst vacation ever. And yet, as a species, we're like, well, let's make the robots that eat corpses and see what happens.
I think relatively the cannibal idea, if we relate it to film, like when did that start? Because the only thing I can think of more modern reference would be something like Walking Dead, where they were eating people. There was a season where they introduced that, but I don't really see a whole lot of movies like that. But when I do, it's weird how my brain immediately thinks this person's a psychopathic monster. And I've had someone bring up the point, like, well, there are religions that do. And it's like, yeah, the idea that, like, I guess it's just because our culture is so adverse to that.
Well, it's funny that you bring that up because I was about to say um, disposal of the dead is cultural. So, for example, in Tibet, they use sky burial. The body is cut up and fed to vultures, and that's because In Tibet, in the Himalayas, there aren't enough trees to make cremation effective. We don't have enough wood to burn dead bodies. The ground is mostly rock, and during half the year it's frozen so solid you can't dig anyway. So when you have dead bodies in this place that has no fuel for fire, no place to bury, how do we dispose of our dead bodies respectfully? And the easiest thing to do is feed the meat and the viscera to birds, then grind up the bones, and then those can be spread. The Tibetan word for sky burial is actually something called feeding the mountain. And the idea is first the birds will consume your body, and you will pass through the digestive system of the birds, and their waste products will fall from them onto the mountains. And then your remaining bone dust that's all ground up will also be spread among the mountains. And it's this whole idea of you've come from nature, and to nature you will return. And certainly in Christian burial, we talk about, remember, man, thou art dust, and to dust thou shalt return. Except we're not trying to return to dust. We're going to stuff our body full of chemicals the second you die, put you in your Sunday go to meeting best, put you in a $3,000 metal box lined with silk to make you look like you're asleep, particularly because in Western culture, we like to deny death. We really want to pretend it doesn't exist. So we go out of the way to have people die in hospice and die in hospital. We take them, the language that we use is avoiding of death. We no longer send people to morticians. They go to funeral directors. It makes that sound like Steven Spielberg's in charge of sending you to the afterlife. We talk about, if you've ever been to a funeral, no one ever says, "Hey, I'm sorry your mom died," because that's so direct and obvious. Instead, you say, "I'm sorry for your loss. You know, your grandfather's in a better place." And I'm the idiot at the family funeral being like, "No, he's not. He's in that box." Because we're acknowledging the reality of, no, that's a dead body. Instead, we talk about, well, the body isn't the person. They're in a better place. They're with God now. That over there is just dust. But we just spent $10,000 to take that dust, put it in a really nice box, and put it in real estate. So, for example, when you go to San Francisco, there are no cemeteries in the city of San Francisco. It's too expensive to keep dead bodies in a city where real estate costs are that high. So, San Francisco moved all of its dead bodies to Colma, literally a city outside of San Francisco that is San Francisco Cemetery, an entire town that's there for San Francisco's dead. For every living person in Colma, there's something like 25 dead people. And that's because we love the dead and we miss the dead, but we value the real estate more. And even when you look at American cemeteries, I grew up in a small town in New England, and in the center of the town, there are, it's sort of the main street runs through, and there are four corners. Each corner has a different denomination church, and each church has its own cemetery. And that's from like the 1700s or late 1600 through the 1900s. And then suddenly now the town has cemeteries way on the outskirts of town. And rather than tightly packed with high tombstones, it's a memorial park. It's no longer a cemetery or a graveyard. It's a memorial park. And it's a place where you can go and walk your dog. And it's nice and rural and friendly. And it's a park. And we talk about this is the garden of eternal rest because we're trying to avoid confronting the fact that we are meat that someday will die. And that's our culture's approach to death.
The most fascinating thing I've ever heard about death is a couple of friends of mine, one who studies a PhD on Japanese, I think it's memorials or burials, their cemeteries, plots. And he goes, yeah, at a period it just stops. And I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, the only early ones, like the earliest ones, the basic ones, where it was just this is this person. It's not even a name on it, or you can't read it. And he goes, because they eventually shifted. And then I learned from another friend of mine who talked about the currency of the samurai sword. And that's their remembrance. That's their family member. That's why they can talk to it because they believe that their spirit is in this. And I'm like, I like that a hell of a lot better. I mean, you can get rid of my body, just keep a memento. I mean, when my grandma passed away, they were selling me keychains that I can put her ashes in and all this. And I'm like, you start looking into the whole history and the culturalization of death over here. And I mean, it's a dirty, dirty market. And they say it's like, oh, Costco was selling caskets at one point. So you just get to like, what? I mean, they're gone, but you're like, do you care about your loved one? Well, then you want to buy the $10,000 casket. And you're like, oh, man.
We've turned death into a business, and business is booming. Um, but the ultimate effect of that is to remove death from our everyday lives. 100 years ago, most people died at home surrounded by family. And when you were a little kid, as families lived close together in larger units, you were home when your uncle died, or when your cousin got kicked in the head by a horse and died a day later, or your
Jesus.
little sibling got sick and passed away. And there's this whole culture of Victorian death photography where we very rarely take photographs. It's too expensive. So people would pose with, if someone died, they'd bring the photographer and the family would pose around the dead body. A child would die and you'd have the living children pose around the dead child. So it would have this memory of them because we want to preserve the memory of the dead person. But we were sort of used to it, and the family would prepare the body for burial. In more rural areas, the family would literally make the casket and dig the grave, and there's this sense of the larger community continuing. And what we've done in contemporary America is to completely remove that. You die in the hospital. If you're lucky, your family is there and say goodbye, and then immediately your body is ushered away to the morgue, where then a funeral director will come and pick it up and take it to the funeral home. And the next time you see them, it just looks like your family member sleeping. And we try to avoid death at all costs because it is the worm at the core, as a book says. We're the only species that knows it's going to die. And as a result, we do everything we can to avoid that fact. We get gym memberships to keep this thing, this flesh in good working order. And we don't plan our own funerals for the most part. We think we're going to live forever. Uh, and other cultures seem to have a much healthier attitude towards death. And we sublimate that fear into horror movies. We sublimate that fear into other things. And it's sad, what we feel is the loss of someone gone. But the actual death, the actual experience of someone dying and then dealing with this dead body has been completely removed from about 98% of Americans' experience. If you're not a funeral director, you don't deal with dead bodies at all, which is a completely different experience than life was 100 years ago.
It was you mentioned about in horror films. I actually had a question about that as well too. Do you find I don't maybe it's just my perspective on this, but did you find that it's weird how if we watch someone get tortured, like cut up, and you're hoping that this person makes it out, or you're just very very scared because this person's getting like a leg, like Saw movies, for instance. But then you see a movie like Would You Rather, where they're doing it to themselves, all on the basis of a game that they're playing, and it's a different type of fear. It's not even really a fear. It's more of like, oh God, he's gonna do that. Oh, it's more like that compared to I hope this person gets free and they go back to wherever they come from. It's more of a self-inflicted abuse.
Sure. Well, the things like Would You Rather combine two different, if I may, subgenres of horror. There's body horror, bad things being done to human bodies, and then there's the psychological horror, which we also see. I mean, you brought up the Saw films. This is an example. You're going to die, or you're going to cut up this other person and pull a key out of their heart and use it to open your trap. Or there, two of you are standing here. One of you is going to walk out of here. The other one is going to end up inside a shark. And it's that okay. Not only do you have to do something, the one that always got me, I think, is in Saw 2, where the woman has to jump into a pit full of hypodermic needles to find the thing that she needs to sort of escape. And I'm like, oh man, a whole pit full of dirty needles, and you're rolling around and looking for stuff, just constantly getting jabbed. And that's not necessarily life threatening unless the needles are dirty, but it's that notion of you have to do it, that you have to bring yourself to self harm. Uh, So it's body horror combined with that psychological horror of you have to do it yourself, otherwise other people or you are going to be even worse hurt. And so horror in some ways is a thought experiment. Because if you take a philosophy class, they're like, okay, there's a train headed towards four people tied on a track, or you can throw a switch and you can run over just one person. What do you do? And it's an ethical question, and it's a thought experiment designed to get you thinking about your ethics. If you do nothing, the four people will die, but your hands are clean. You can switch tracks and save four people, but by saving those four, you purposefully kill another person. So what does that say about you? And horror movies are sort of that writ large because we also tend to sit there and game theory them as we're watching them, right? What I love about horror movies, and I learned this from an early age as a teenager, watching because I grew up in the '80s, all these slasher films, and that you were sort of legally required to talk back to the screen if you were in the movie theater, where people like, "Don't go in the house. Freddy's in the house. Why are you going in the house?" Man, if I were there, I'd get in a car. I would drive across the state line. I'd get myself a shotgun. Like you game theory what you would do if you were in those circumstances, because you wouldn't do what the idiots in the movie do. And I think the pandemic showed, oh no, we are idiots. There would be people running into the haunted house to be like, it's not haunted. Let's go see. There's just a guy with a chainsaw in here. It's fine. So I think horror, one of the things that horror does for us is it allows us to imagine the worst possible scenarios. It allows us to scare ourselves a little. I fully admit I think I'm a horror fan because I am terrified of my own death. I'm okay with other people's, but my own is what terrifies me. And so I think horror allows me to imagine the possibility of confronting death. And I'd rather confront death by watching, say, The Conjuring or The Exorcist or Saw than by being in a plane crash. Like if given a choice, I'll pay the $15 and eat popcorn and enjoy it rather than get in a plane that's going down and have the pilot be like, "All right, crash positions, folks. Some of you will survive." No, that's not my kind of party.
I'm curious, what is your favorite horror film?
You may as well ask me which is my favorite child. It depends on the day and which one is pissing me off most. No, I've got a cluster of about a half dozen to a dozen that I absolutely adore. Films like The Exorcist, Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, The Thing. John Carpenter can do no wrong as far as I'm concerned. Well, Ghosts of Mars. We won't talk about that, but for the most part, John Carpenter delivers wonderful stuff. I really loved the original Nightmare on Elm Street. I think it's responsible for a lot of crappy sequels, but I really loved it. Um, and then there are films that I just watch annually. I watch the anthology film Trick or Treat every Halloween. Whenever I teach my horror cinema class, I show the students Trick or Treat. Uh, there are some simple films that I just really, really enjoy. I love a movie called Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things. It was made down in Miami back in, I think, 73 for about 20 bucks by a group of people who had just graduated from college. It is not a great movie. If you're listening to this podcast, do not go watch it. It is a dumb horror film, but I love it. And it actually has, for my money, two really effective scenes that I think are scary, and then some movie moments that are just really, really fun. And it was also made in 73. So the costumes are beautiful and ridiculous.
I don't know any movie that was worse than Zombie Strippers. I saw that when I was 13. I don't know why that would have been a good, reasonable purchase, but it was the worst thing I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah, I got to admit, 13's not a good age to see zombie strippers. I have a soft spot for that film for one reason and one reason
She had
only.
a lot of soft spots on her, and they weren't good.
Well, there's that. But Jenna Jameson, I can't believe I'm saying this. Jenna Jameson in that film, when she becomes a zombie, it's the film itself. I don't know if you know this, was intended as a parody of American culture during the Iraq War. It's a direct critique of the Bush administration. So I appreciate that they're trying to do that in a film called Zombie Strippers. I'm like, hey, shoot big, folks. But Jenna Jameson's character is reading Nietzsche Beyond Good and Evil in the green room or in the dressing room of the strip club. She goes out on stage, sorry, spoiler alert, gets bitten, becomes a zombie, comes back as a zombie into the dressing room, sits down, picks up Nietzsche, starts reading it again as a zombie, and goes, "Oh, this makes so much more sense now." And I saw it in the movie theater. I fell out of my seat. I was laughing so hard. I was like, that is a brilliant joke. I don't know how many people in the audience got it, but okay, okay, movie, you're the movie, and I'm willing to go on this ride with you. Most of it is TNA, gore, and dumb jokes, but there is an intelligence behind it. And it was supposedly inspired by absurdist theater, Beckett and Ionesco. And as a theater professor, I was catching those references going, cool. Okay, these are smart people making a dumb movie. You know what? Let the edibles kick in and enjoy it, which is something you really can't say as a 13-year-old.
Um, do you have a critique on just the modern way horror films are now? Like I like a lot of old school horror films. My favorite is Jaws. It'll always be Jaws. I'm not necessarily afraid of sharks or being eaten. I just like everything about it, from the songs to "We're gonna need a bigger boat." I could quote the whole damn movie.
Oh,
Uh,
good Lord. Robert Shaw as Quint is a gift from God that just keeps giving. And, that film came out. I was too young to see the film when it came out. I saw it when it was edited for television. That's a film I watch every summer. When I was in college, and you could not get away with this now, but when I was in college, they got a projector and projected Jaws on the roof of our college swimming pool,
I've done
and you
that.
could rent
I've
an
done
inner
that.
tube for $1, and you're just floating in the water watching it. And I live in California. We create a backyard movie theater. We hang a screen on the back of the house, and we inflate a kiddie pool full of water and watch Jaws, outdoors in the summer, sitting in water. And it still creeps me out, but I find myself walking around. And I've been doing this since I was like 12, just fairly well and do, you fair Spanish
Yeah.
ladies. And every once in a while,
Ladies of Spain.
I'll shake my father's hand and be like, "You got it. You got soft hands. You got money counting
That
hands."
was my ringtone for a while, was that song.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's such a good film. But here's the thing I think about Jaws. The first half of Jaws is a horror film, and Spielberg was so smart. He hides that shark from you. You just see a fin. You see Alex Kintner flip over, and you're like, "What? I don't." Uh, and you don't see the shark until, for my money, the scariest moment in the film, when the rowboat flips over, and the guy is like swimming, and you see the shark sort of sideways underwater coming up with its mouth open. That to this day still scares the crap out of me. I'm like, oh, I hate that shot. Kudos, Spielberg. But the second half of Jaws is actually an action film. It's about these three guys on a boat trying to bring down a shark. And that's once you see the shark, you're like, oh, it's a 25-foot shark. It's a big, scary shark, but it's not really a horror film because horror at heart, if I may quote Lovecraft, is about fear of the unknown. Every horror film at heart is a mystery. All these teenagers are dying. What's going on? And then finally you find out, oh, well, mommy burned the janitor because he was a pedophile. Or, well, it turns out grandpa's a werewolf. We never told you. And that's sort of the problem with slasher sequels is if you look at all the original slashers, Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, even things like Sleepaway Camp, it's a mystery. We don't know who's doing the killing or why until it's finally revealed. Here's who the killer is. Here's why they're killing. And the mystery is solved. And the film ends. And with the sequel, it's okay. Now we know why the killer is killing. Now we know who the killer is. Now we're just here to see the killing, which is why by the time you hit Nightmare on Elm Street 4, I can name Nancy, Tina. I can name the kids from the first Nightmare on Elm Street. I don't know the names of any of the characters in the subsequent films, but everybody knows Freddy Krueger because we're there to see people die. We're there to watch someone die every 8 minutes. And that's why Nightmare on Elm Street then gets the really interesting kill sequences. That's why by the time Jason goes to hell, his armory has vastly increased. He's going to use a spear gun. He's going to pick someone up in a sleeping bag and bang him against the tree because we're literally just there to see the kills.
I'm pretty sure you probably noticed, and you rattled off a couple of some of your favorites, and they all probably stick around a certain genre type of horror, like if it's dead monsters, or if it's something of that sort. I found mine was I do not get scared in scary movies. I don't. Jaws doesn't scare me. None of those. I've seen them all in theaters. I don't know. It just doesn't. When they do remakes, I love going to like theater nights, $5 movies. They'll play like Jaws or they'll play some old school thing. Nothing beats a recliner on the big screen, man. But what does get me is any movie that is a severe mental health issue. The Visit being one of them. Like I was watching, I was like, oh my God, these grandparents are gonna kill the kids. And I figured it's not the actual grandparents, a bunch of insane people. I visibly stood up in the theater and was like, Jesus Christ. And my mom's like, what? Is like that gets you? I'm like, yes, that gets me. It's just because it's nuts. And then you get like Split and Glass. And I love M. Night Shyamalan's films. I love them all because they got the weird twist. You're not expecting things. It's like I Am Legend's another one of my favorites. I'm not scared of the zombies, but I'm more like in this, like it's just this, you learn it every time you're watching, you pick up something different. And that is something I really appreciate about a film to leave many messages in it.
Oh, yeah. The film that does that for me is the remake of Dawn of the Dead. As a huge zombie fan, as a huge Romero fan, I went to see it the day it opened and sat in the theater watching, going, okay, okay. Because I had seen at that point, there were already 3 or 4 remakes of Night of the Living Dead, and most of them weren't worth anything. And I was like, this is different than the original, but it's doing something, and I can't quite figure out what. And I don't know if I like it or not. So, walked out of the theater, bought a ticket, went back in, watched it again, and went, okay, this is doing something different than Romero did, and it's doing it really interestingly. So when it came out on DVD, I watched it several times, and that's a film that every time I watch it, I get something new out of it and see something different and go, that's a very clever moment. That's a very smart moment. In terms of the mental health thing, it's an area where horror has to be careful because horror has had a history of stigmatizing mental illness and stigmatizing people who suffer from mental illness. And, people who do already suffer enough and already suffer enough social stigma. But the films that you're talking about, I get that, and here's why. Because at heart, horror does two things. Noel, this is coming from Noel Carroll's book, um, uh, the Paradox of Horror. Carroll says there are two paradoxes of horror which don't make sense. One, we go to horror to be scared, which is weird because we don't do that in real life. Like no, we were just talking before the show. No one drives into a hurricane being like, "Oh my God, there's a hurricane. Let's go see if bad things
Storm
happen."
Chasers.
Yeah, no one like walks down an alley hoping to hear footsteps behind them. All right. No one puts themselves intentionally in a terribly dangerous situation and wishes they had popcorn. So Carol's like, we don't seek out fear in real life. We don't seek out monsters in real life. So why do we want to be entertained by them? And two, when last I looked, werewolves aren't real.
What?
I know, I'm sorry. Spoiler alert.
Damn.
Werewolves aren't real, vampires aren't real, zombies aren't real. And that's why Carol says the problem with those films is we know they're not real, and yet we go to be scared by them. And that's why films that deal with either serial killers or mental illness can actually be much scarier because those are real. And it's that notion of, the kids have never met the grandparents, they show up, and the mother's finally like, "Oh, those aren't your grandparents." That relates back to every little urban legend we've ever heard. My favorite is the babysitter and the clown statue, where babysitter shows up. There's a clown statue in the living room. It's life size and it's super scary. And it's just there and it doesn't move. And the parents call, kids are fine. Parents call again a few hours later. Oh, yeah, the kids are fine. Babysitter says, I really got to tell you, no disrespect, but that clown statue scares the crap out of me. And the parents say, get the kids and get out of the house now. And the babysitter says, why? They say, we don't have a clown statue. "Grr."
But I mean, there's a weird area in our history, though, or just in our culture, where paranormal stuff is scary. I know people that will not watch a demonic possession film, because they believe in that type of stuff. But it's one area. It's like we can't consider paranormal a myth. I mean, I'm not the type that's like, oh, 100% into the paranormal, but there is some like. I have friends that are ghost hunters and they don't BS. They don't do any of that X-File stuff. They go on these things, but Amityville Horror House. Nobody's gonna buy that house. Nobody wants to go live in that house. It's like trying to buy the
People
Manson house.
people do live in that house now, and they asked to change the house number because they're tired of people stopping by. And they've even changed the exterior look of the house because they just want to live in their home. And they're like, we've not had any problems. The house actually cost a couple million. It's a really nice house. We don't want to deal with that. But you raise a really great point. Douglas Cowan says in this wonderful book, Sacred Terror, The Exorcist is a scary film because of the special effects and all the scary stuff in it. It's a million times scarier if you believe demons are real. Paranormal Activity is a very scary film. It's very effective as a scary film. It's the greatest film ever made about a door closing slowly. But it is even more terrifying if you believe ghosts are real and that ghosts can harm you. The Conjuring is a good horror film. It's the only horror film that is rated R that does not have a single death in it. That blew my mind when I figured that out. Conjuring is rated R, nobody dies in it. But if you think ghosts are real, if you believe the Warrens really were genuine paranormal investigators, that film is scary because it does depict reality. So the more real we think horror is, the more effective it is.
Well,
When I,
shit,
you know, when I
Pet Cemetery is a good one, and that's not real. It's not necessarily scary. It's just it'll pull at your heart and get you on your seat.
But that's the cleverness, and here's where I'm gonna pay a little homage to Stephen King here. That's the cleverness of Pet Sematary. I think that I read that when I was 13, and that's the first book that genuinely frightened me to the point where I'm like, "I'm leaving the lights on just in case." King convinces you in the reality of this world. While you're reading, you believe that the Micmac burial ground or the land beyond the Micmac burial ground that has gone bad, that is stalked by a Wendigo, speaking of cannibal monsters. King makes you believe. And I think that's the difference between literature and movies. Movies are immersive. You watch them, but they're also just colored lights on a wall with a soundtrack or, digital coding on your screen. When you're reading a book, you immerse yourself into that world for a much longer time, much more effectively. You get to know the inner thoughts of the character. And I've always found horror books much, much more scary than horror movies. And again, because I'm a theater guy, I find immersive theater horror to be the scariest of all because, and I say this as the guy who directed Evil Dead the musical in Los Angeles 10 years ago. It's a doofy musical. If you've never seen it, Evil Dead the musical is so much fun. I did it because I'm a huge Evil Dead fan. It's not a scary musical, but people got freaked out because when the actors who are playing the Evil Dead begin dancing and moving into the audience, you realize the monsters are in the same space as you. If you're watching a movie, you can get rid of the monsters simply by closing your eyes, turning off the thing. But in a theater, the monsters can and will follow you out. I just went to see a play last night in an actual mausoleum and cemetery. The play was set there, and it was immersive and site specific. So you are being led through this mausoleum, and you are aware that you're surrounded by all these bodies as this play is unfolding. And the entire thing, all the lights are out, the entire thing is being lit by electric candles and fake lanterns. So it's just all these flickering things on the wall. And it's so much more real and immersive because you are actually in this cemetery. And kudos to the people who did it. They set up speakers around the wall outside the cemetery. So at one point, they're like, this thing is coming, and you can hear it walking. And we heard, the footsteps going around the cemetery. And it was so effective. And it would not have been nearly as scary, I don't think, had I been sitting on my couch watching it on Netflix.
Well, that's like the whole theater experience in general. It's like why people like going to the movies is having that surround sound and having that different atmosphere. Because at your house, I mean, you can't really watch a film in your house and actually expect to be able to pay attention to it the very first time you watch, unless it's like date night and whoever you're with is making you put your phone down and spend time with them. But like even then, I'm like, let's watch a JFK documentary. Come on, and but it's that film like Bird Box. I'm not a fan of Bird Box. I bet the book is great. I've talked to Armand. I think it's Rosamila is his last name. I could be mistakenly saying that wrong. I
Who?
His name's Armand Rosamila. I think his last name is. I don't know if you know him, but he's friends with the guy who wrote Bird Box, and it
Josh
turned into
Malin,
a
yes.
movie. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
I know Josh too.
I'm not a fan of the movie. I just don't like Sandra Bullock. I just don't like that. But also, I didn't really like the movie. What is it? The Don't Talk or whatever. It has two movies now. I don't even remember what the name's called. It has the guy who plays in The Office in it.
Oh, Don't Speak, or there are two now. Don't Talk.
It's about monsters. If you make a noise, they kill
Oh,
you.
oh, oh, the Quiet Place.
Yeah, I'm not a fan
Quiet
of
Place
that
and Quiet
either.
Place
I
Part
don't
Two.
because maybe most of the movie's not talking or nothing's going on, no noise or anything like that. But I don't know a lot of the today's stuff, and maybe it was always like this, but a lot of it's like jump scares, where it's like I like a movie like Bones, like M. Night Shyamalan, where they're on this beach and they're aging, and that lady drops a rock on her and her bones all start. That gets me. Anything with fingers where fingers break, I immediately would just melt in my seat.
Yeah. Uh, the I think what it is really, there. Stephen King says there are three levels of horror, and I like this taxonomy because I think it's useful. At the bottom level is the gross out, the jump scare. It's the blood, the gore, and the boo. And we know how jump scares work. There's a door at the end of the hall. Someone. The music begins. The person walks down. They're looking for the cat. Jones, where are you? Where are you? They get down. We make a big show of putting the hand on the knob, turning the knob, opening the door quickly, and nothing. Everyone's like, oh. And you relax, and the person turns around and monster. And we all know what's going to happen. We all know what's coming. But movies have trained us. Here comes the jump scare. Second level is, of course, horror. This is giant spiders the size of horses. This is werewolves and vampires, things that should not be, and just sort of philosophically are a little bit more scary. But the best kind of horror is terror. That's where everything in your house is replaced with an exact replica. That's where you hear a voice in your ear say, behind you, and you turn around and there's nothing there. Um, mm, the best example I can think of this is if you've ever come home to your house and you walk in and the back door is open, and you're like, oh my God, I don't remember leaving the back door open. Maybe someone broke in, maybe we just left the back door open, and suddenly everything in your house is suspect. Is someone in here? And this place that is a place of safety, that is your home, it's where all your stuff is, has just become kind of the most terrifying place in your life, at least for the next few minutes. It's what Freud calls the unheimlich, which gets translated as the uncanny. Excuse me. But what it really means is unhomelike. You think this place is familiar, but suddenly it's completely defamiliarized. And for me, that is the best kind of movie that does that to you. That uh, there's an old horror movie that's really cheesy that has its moments called Witchboard, about this woman who's slowly becoming obsessed with a Ouija board. And at one point, her fiance and her ex uh, use the Ouija board by a lake to try and contact the spirit of the little dead boy that they think it is. And they suddenly learn it's never been the little dead boy, it's something else. A creature called Malfader, which is Portuguese for evil spirit. And they're like, what is Malfader? What is Malfader? And the Ouija board keeps spelling Her, Her, Malfader is her, Malfader is her. And I'm like, it's her, she's Malfader, she's possessed. And the board keeps saying, no, no, no. And finally, they're like, oh, you said ghosts are terrible spellers. Malfader is her. And the planchette suddenly stops. And they look down and it stopped on E. And he's like, it just stopped. What was he trying to spell? Her. And the other guy goes, E. And everyone in the audience immediately goes, oh, Malfader is here. And then all hell breaks loose. And I was like, that is so, because you're going, what is it? What is it? What is it? And you get the jump scare, but then it's also that sort of, oh, it's here. And that's a film that sort of kept me up for a while in the best possible way. I want to be scared. It drives me mad. Like I watch horror movies with my wife and sort of feed off of her like a parasite. When she's like all tense, I'm like, yes, yes, be afraid. It feeds me. We watched the Netflix streaming of Hill House show, episode 8. And if you watch the show, you know the exact moment I'm talking about. There's a jump scare moment that I was completely unprepared for. I'm watching the film going, "That's brilliant, that's clever. Oh, that's really eerie and creepy. Oh, the bowler hat man, that's so effective." And I just analyze horror movies as I watch them because that's what I do. And there's a moment in that episode 8 that's a jump scare that I was so unprepared for. For the first time in like 25 years, I screamed out loud. I was like, "Ah!" And my wife paused the show to go on social media and inform all of our family and friends, Kevin just screamed. And there was this immediate outpouring. When, where, how, what made that happen? What is so scary it got him? I was like, Haunting of Hill House. I doff my cap to you, Mr. Flanagan. You made a very effective, scary movie that I forgot to get ready for the jump scare that I should have seen coming and didn't. So as like the guy who thinks he's the mayor of Chilitown and goes into chili eating contest because bring on the insanity, bring on the ghost peppers. I'm ready. For me, that's horror. I'm like, bring on the scary movie. See if you can scare me. Haunting of Hill House did, and I will be forever grateful.
It's like half the movies we watch now, you're expecting there to be a jump scare at a certain scene, and that's why you're surprised when there's not one. I really like what you mentioned before about like that message, like people that slowly, like they're kind of confused, they're trying to understand it, and then like all of a sudden in one quick instance they get it, and they're like, "Oh my God!" Like you're because that whole time you should have been, your body's like kind of preparing. There's going to be someone around this corner. There's going to be someone around this corner, and then there's not, and then you're like, "Okay, what's going to come later then?" But you're on your seat for it. But when it's something that's like a message or it's something that's just
Mhm.
completely you do not expect, and then it happens. Like I think
It's that twist. You talked about M. Night Shyamalan. It's that moment in The Ring, which is not a Shyamalan film, but that moment in The Ring where the mother comes back and she's like, "Oh, don't worry, baby. Mommy freed her. Mommy went to the well and freed her." And the little boy's like, "Why did you free her? You weren't supposed to do that. Now she's in the world. Now she can get everyone." And everyone in the theater at once is like, "Oh, fuck." You go home and burn all your VHS tapes because whoa! And the best films, the M. Night Shyamalan is sort of famous for this to the point where it's, made fun of constantly of, "Oh, no, you're dead," and everything before that suddenly changes, and you realize this whole film is not what I thought it was.
Yeah, I mean, does it ever get kind of hard for you to I mean, I'm sure you enjoy watching horror films, but I mean, the fact that you don't get scared, because it kind of seems like that's a lot of the point as well too. Like, I know you're surprised when one does scare you, and but
Delighted.
okay, it's just it's got to be difficult though. I mean, I don't really watch a whole lot of horror films just because there's no point. Like, of everyone else in the theater is all like, "Oh my God," and I'm just kind of like, okay.
Well, the funny thing is, I like going to the theater to watch horror movies. I think part of the problem is when you watch horror films alone, for the same reason comedy doesn't work alone. If you're sitting on a couch watching a comic film, you tend not to laugh. You might smile, you might chuckle out loud once or twice. But if you're in a movie theater watching the latest Will Ferrell magnum opus, you will laugh a lot more because it's that uh, it's that collective identity of an audience. For me, the funny thing is Paranormal Activity became a comedy because I went to see it at a movie theater in Santa Monica at midnight the week that it came out, and there was, either a very drunk or very high man about 3 rows behind me, and he was utterly terrified, and as a result, the rest of us in the audience were very amused because the second would be like night 13, and they show the night vision. They show the 2 of them in bed, and then it fast forwards to to 3 a.m. This guy 3 rows back suddenly starts going, "Oh, Jesus God. Oh, Jesus God, what's gonna happen? Oh, fuck me, what's gonna happen?" And everyone just starts kinda laughing. And then, the door closes slowly, and this guy is, like, wetting himself. He's like, "Oh god, no, the door's moving!" And it sort of dispelled all the tension. But rather than being mad at him, I think we were all just laughing at how scared he was. It was fun. And that's why, you go to a haunted house, you go on a haunted attraction with your friends because everyone has the one friend that's like utterly terrified of everything. And so you go, I go to these things because I'm not scared. I go because I know my friend, Mel is going to be like, ah, God, why? And clinging people's arms and saying thank you to people. That's she's like, thank you. When the person comes out, hello, want to die night. She's like, thank you, no, thank you, thank you, thank you. She thanks all the haunt workers because that's her way of dealing with her own fear. And I'm just walking behind her going, thank you. This is wonderful.
I wouldn't call this a horror film, but it was a scene that first time in a long time that a movie's actually visibly got me to stand up and be like, holy, like like get like prepare myself. And that was Doctor Strange, Universe of Madness.
Multiverse of Madness, yeah.
When Black Bolt's head exploded, I was not expecting that at all. I was
Nope.
not, and it took me back, dude. My buddy's like, dude, it's just another multiverse. They'll just find another one that they can go into, and he'll be alive. And I'm like, it doesn't matter. That just was, I was not expecting that at all.
Yeah, I mean, the you said it, why watch horror because, you can't be scared. I mean, I can get on edge, but I watch horror for 2 reasons then. 1, I can be surprised, and that surprise can be a source of great delight. There's, oh god, what is the name of it? I saw this film at the LA Film Festival, Beast? It'll come back to the Feast. It's called Feast, where it's sort of this bar out in the middle of the desert that is being attacked by the creatures, and it's a horror comedy. It's very tongue in cheek, and it's showing you the characters. And each character, the first time you see them, is a freeze frame, and it sort of gives you their name. Their name, their odds of surviving, and something about them. And then, just as the monsters start to attack, this guy in a t-shirt with a shotgun bursts into the bar. They're like, "Who the hell are you?" He's like, "I'm the thing that's gonna keep you alive." And they freeze frame and it's like, Johnny Hero. And he looks like Ash from Evil Dead. And he just walks in and he's got the chest and the jawline. He's like, "If you listen to me and do everything I say, you just might get out of this alive." And suddenly the window behind him bursts open. One of the monsters reaches in, grabs him, tears him to pieces, and throws his head on the pool table. And everyone in the bar is like, wow, it looks like we're all gonna die now. I thought that was the hero. And it just so surprised me. I wasn't scared. I just went, "Okay, movie, you just told us, you know, whatever your expectations are, we're not gonna follow them. We're gonna do what we feel like doing. Nobody is safe. Anyone can die. There are no rules here, and we're gonna make fun of you for even believing the rules exist." And so that surprised me, and I'm like, "I'm really gonna enjoy this movie." And I did. So I like being surprised. I also like films, that intellectually make me go, "Oh, that's worrisome." I'm not sitting here terrified, but you're gonna keep me awake a little bit now thinking about these things. The Conjuring to me is one of the best scary movies of all time because you're terrified of nothing. If you've seen the film, there's a scene where the 2 girls are in the bedroom, and one of them is staring in the corner going, and she's utterly terrified, and the other sister's like, "What's wrong?" She's like, "Don't you see her? She's right there." And the other sister looks over and goes, "There's nothing there." "No, she's right there. It's staring at us." And I was like, "Oh, okay, where are we going with this movie?" And the other sister who can't see it walks over and is looking around, is just there and goes, "There's nothing here." And the sister in bed says, "It's right next to you." And everyone in the theater is climbing their seats because we can't see it either. but there is clearly something there. And so the movie just told the audience, there are things that exist that you cannot see, and it can be standing right next to you, and you will never know it. And what makes the film so brilliant is after setting up all this tension, the door to the bedroom that's right next to the girl then slams, and see, it can do stuff. And everyone in the theater screamed, and I applauded, going, "Brilliant! You just had us terrified of nothing." But now we know we have no idea what's gonna be in the shot. James Wan, for my money, is one of the best horror directors working today. Him, Jordan Peele, Karen Kusama, I will watch anything these people make. Just absolutely wonderful stuff. Conjuring, brilliant. Insidious, even Dead Silence, which is an absolutely great, very smart horror film. James Wan not only gave us Insidious and the Conjuring franchise, he also gave us Saw. I mean, who else can you think of created 3 different horror franchises that have had now at least half a dozen films each? Saw kind of went off the rails around number 2, but even so, kudos to James Wan, man. He's a horror director to watch.
What do you think about using real documentaries and picking a horrible thing and making that a horror?
The whole Dahmer debate that's going on right now, that, the families are really upset that this got made. There For me, this is part of a larger debate, and I'll come back and answer that question in a second, but there's a larger debate about horror that I talk about with my students is you realize we're getting pleasure out of people dying. We're getting pleasure out of trauma. That when you watch a film like I Spit on Your Grave, part of the enjoyment of the film is there's a 40-minute long sexual assault sequence that's just assaults the audience as well. And we're not meant to enjoy that, but we're then meant to enjoy watching this woman in the second half of the film slaughter the 5 guys who assaulted her. That when you're watching Friday the 13th, even the first one, the 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 entertainment value comes from watching people get murdered, which we would not want to see in real life. And here's where I'm going to bring in Aristotle because I'm a college professor and it makes me sound smart. Aristotle says, yeah, but that's the whole point. Nobody wants to see an accident. I've seen accidents. I've seen people die. It's not fun. It's not entertaining. It's very traumatic as well. Watching horror is traumatic. So a lot of horror films are like, don't look, say, don't look. And when we're at the horror film, what do? We turn away because we don't want to see the horrific thing happening. But that's Aristotle says that's the whole point of horror. We go because it teaches us coping skills. It teaches us, social context. You go to horror films when you're in middle school with all your friends, partly as a rite of passage, but also to show, that you can handle it. You're watching with your friends and you're like, that's not scary. And we all say that's not scary, even though some of us are scared, because it becomes this sort of part of our growth. And for me as an adult, watching horror helps me deal with my own mortality, helps me deal with scary situations, and horror itself changes. One of my favorite horror films is Jim Nichols' Stakeland, and I think Jim Nichols is another great director whose work I really admire and love. And Stakeland is basically a zombie film, but with vampires. The vampires aren't intelligent. When they bite you, you become one of them. But the vampires in America has become Stakeland. It's a brilliant post 9/11 film. But at the beginning of the film, there's a family that's trying to sort of get away from the vampire epidemic and a vampire gets into the barn where they're repairing the car to leave. And at one point, you see the vampire, and they're not, like 30 Days of Night or Dracula. These aren't people in formal wear being like, good evening. It's these vampires are feral, they're monstrous. And the camera just sort of pans up in the flickering flashlight, and the vampire just has a baby in its mouth, and it opens its jaws and drops it. You hear it hit the ladder and then hit the floor. I saw this film before I had kids, and I'm like, "Oh, that's really effective." Now that I have kids, I'm like, "Oh, I don't wanna see that." Like, it hits me where I live now because I have children. So, horror is effective because it shows us our worst fears and helps us to cope with them. So, we're getting entertainment out of trauma. As Noel Carroll mentioned earlier, the paradox of horror is we're watching things that we shouldn't wanna see. And to be a horror fan, or even worse, to be a horror writer, I like to say telling people you're a horror writer is like saying, "I'm thinking about getting into serial killing." You're like, "Oh, he just said that he's thinking about getting into it. So he isn't one yet, but keep an eye on him in case he decides to start tonight." It's like, "No, I'm not a bad person." The horror writers that I know, I'm a member of the Horror Writers Association. I know hundreds of horror writers, and they are among the nicest, kindest people you ever meet. And that's probably because we work out all of our aggression in our fiction. You piss me off, I'm gonna kill you in a short story. And then I'm just gonna be nice to you in real life. I'm like, "Oh, I'm not crazy about my neighbor." George got killed by the monster. And I'm like, now I feel so much better. So I can wave and say hi to him. We're all really super nice people. We're kind. The funny thing is, most horror writers don't believe in ghosts, don't believe in monsters, don't believe in the paranormal. A lot do, but I'm surprised by the sheer number that don't. It's just sort of the milieu in which we express. People, the funny thing is, as a horror writer, people ask me, do you believe in these things? I'm like, would you ask George Martin if he believes in dragons? Would you ask J.R.R. Tolkien, does he believe that elves and dwarves are real? Are we concerned about a corrupt race of elves known as orcs? No, they're not evil. They're not real either. I write a kind of fantasy. It's just my fantasy happens to involve a lot of ghosts. I understand people believe in ghosts. I respect that you've had those experiences. I would love to have one of those experiences. I go on ghost walks all the time. I go on ghost tours. I want to have the experience. I don't want to be haunted. I don't want to be possessed, but I would love to see a full torso apparition just so I could be like, oh, it is real. Cool. Okay. But until then, I'll take your word for it, but I haven't experienced it. So horror is also my way to live at least for an hour and a half, 2 hours in a much more magical world. Because the other thing is when we watch like zombie films, when you watch a zombie film, Robbie, do you imagine yourself as like one of the first victims? You're like, I'd be bitten day one. Or
I
you'd
had
be
a
like,
I had a really intense dream where I was like, I spent so much of my time like I could easily survive The Walking Dead. It'd be so awesome. Then I had a really intense dream about zombies, and I was like, there's no way I'd be dead day one. Not even the infection. I'd probably be case zero.
yeah, see, you're different. Most people are like, oh, I'd survive. I'd be in a small group and we would have knives and guns. We'd be up in the attic. Like, I would talk to my students who had plans and they'd be like, okay, here's the thing, blades don't need reloading. Here in California, it's a lot of work to get a gun. You can buy a sword easy. Blades don't need reloading. We live in a third floor apartment. I figure you block off the stairwell. I'm like, you've given this some thought. But I know you. If there were a zombie outbreak on campus, you wouldn't get to your car.
Just ask which types of zombies. Is it World War Z? Nobody's surviving. Those things are piled up on top of each other and climbing up windows and
Yeah.
things.
If only it weren't such bad CGI. That's a movie that I love the concept. The book is so much better and so much more expensive. I love the concept. Like you find a way to make zombies even more scary with the whole mob mentality and climbing up over walls. But the CG is just so. Eh. I'm a practical effects guy. I just saw Smile this week, and that film is, I think, like 95% practical effects, not CG. And it's so much more effective because of it. The Howling, brilliant movie because it's all practical effects. The Howling and American Werewolf in London, those transformation sequences have never been duplicated because Rick Baker and Rob Bottin did all practical effects. And you see a person become a wolf in front of the camera, and it makes sense. When you see it today with like the Twilight movies, it's like that is so obviously a computer image.
Yeah.
Doesn't work, doesn't scare me.
Well, Kevin, I really appreciate the time you've given me to be able to talk on my show, man. Is there a place where people can find your horror books and
Of
any other
course.
links that you have?
All my fiction and nonfiction is available on Amazon. All the stuff that I do, because I also do a lot of theater. As an actor, I've appeared in several horror movies. You can see it all at my website, www.somethingwetmorethiswaycomes, all one word.com. Wetmore, as in I went out in the rain and got wet more. www.somethingwetmorethiswaycomes.com, just like the Ray Bradbury novel. Or if you're super literate, the quotation from Macbeth. Something wicked this way comes is now www.somethingwetmorethiswaycomes.com.
Well, I'm going to make sure to link it all in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks for listening
Thank
to this
you.
episode of Out of the
Hey,
Blank.
thanks for giving me the opportunity to come and talk horror. You please, please, why are you making me talk about this thing I love? I really appreciate the opportunity, sir, and thanks for having me on such a great podcast. It's a pleasure.